Hello and welcome to yet another virtual event with Tattered Cover Bookstore. My name is Adam. I am the director of events for Tattered Cover. We are an independent bookstore in Denver, Colorado, in the United States, because I feel like we might have a broad audience tonight. If you don't know anything about us, we've been around for 50 years. That's half a century, which is an amazing thing for an independent bookstore, especially after a pandemic when so many bookstores closed. So we would just like to extend our gratitude towards all the readers out there in the virtual world in Denver, in the UK, in Antarctica, wherever you are. And then to authors and writers like tonight's guest or today's guest. I keep saying tonight, I'm so used to it being dark outside when I do these events. Today we have two amazing writers who collaborated on a book called You Feel It Just Below the Ribs. And then we have a moderator who I'm so stoked for. I'm, of course, talking about Jeffrey Cranor and Janina Matthewson, who will be in conversation with Eileen Clark. I'm going to read some bios. Jeffrey is the co-author with Joseph Fink of the New York Times bestselling Welcome to Night Vale, It Devours, and The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home. With Fink, he is the co-writer and producer of the Welcome to Night Vale podcast, with over 300 million downloads in its 9-year run, and the lead podcast in the Night Vale Presents podcast network. He also, which you can find at nightvalepresents.com. He also creates theater and dance pieces with his wife, the choreographer Jillian Sweeney. He lives in New York's Hudson Valley. His Twitter and Instagram handles are Happier Man and Night Vale Radio. Janina is the author of the acclaimed novel Of Things Gone Astray and the novella The Understanding of Woman. She has written audio drama for the BBC Radiotopia, with credits including Murmurs, The Cipher, and Passenger List. Originally from New Zealand, she now lives in London. Her Twitter and Instagram handles are J9 and If. For more on her, please visit myrednotebook.com. The two co-wrote and produced Within the Wires podcast, which has been downloaded nearly 6.5 million times. Their joint Twitter and Instagram handles are Within the Wires. In conversation with them will be Eileen. She is a storyteller, comedian, actor, podcast host, and most importantly, a human and a human lady based in Queens, New York, although she's not there right now, I discovered. She's performed throughout New York City in various venues, including UCB, The Pit, The Creek, and The Cave, Caveat, and more. She is featured in videos by Glamour, Flamma, and Scary Mommy. She currently co-hosts UK Horror, a Latinx horror movie podcast, with her childhood best friend, Jonathan Atkinson, who was going to be here today, but he cannot due to many things. However, I've already said too much. I've talked too much. You're not here for me. You're here for Jeffrey, Janina, and Eileen. I'm going to turn it over to them. Please welcome the guests you are here tonight. Virtual claps all around.
Hello, everyone. We're virtually clapping. My goodness. Hi, guys. How are you?
Good.
Good.
What a thrill. Thrilled to talk about a book to feel smart for one time in my life. I won't lie. I was a little bit nervous when with my best friend and partner, John, not partner, like BFF. Wait, BF. He is my BFF. Anyways, when he was like, I can't make it, I was like, but I need you because I feel dumb. And he was like, you can do this. So I'm feeling very empowered right now to talk about another powerful lady. And this book, I see it backwards. I don't know how to change it. You Feel It Just Below the Ribs. Guys, what a dang book you wrote.
We did.
We did do that.
We wrote a book.
You wrote a dang book. Okay, first of all, this was my first thought. When I saw, you guys both wrote this together, and Johnny and I, being friends for a long time, I was like, oh, how do you balance out a creative and a professional relationship, and then put that thing together and make a work of literature and a novel? That's crazy to me. I can barely say my own name in my podcast. You guys have a bunch of stuff.
I don't know. we talk about things a lot, and then we go away and write things, and we come back together. I have this thing with you know how there's the people claim that when you have a baby, which I don't know, I've never had a baby, but when you have a baby,
I have no idea, but I trust you.
it's like there's stories that you have like the selective amnesia thing that you don't remember how bad it was, and so you don't not want to have another one. And I feel like that also can happen with books where like I know I have written a book before, but I don't know how to do it, even though I have done it and am doing it.
Sure.
It's a nonsense thing to do. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's I definitely I don't have selective amnesia. I've it's the reverse of that, of like selective bad memories. Like I honestly, like the writing of the book is the most fun part, because it's where Janina and I sit around and talk about like what we want the book to be, come up with cool ideas. We both get, it's the most fun thing in the whole world is when somebody has an idea and the other person is like, that sounds really cool. Like you just get fired up for something.
Absolutely.
And that's the most fun part. And then you kind of like hammer out an outline, and then you go away and you kind of divvy up the chapters. We broke this into 4 parts of this book, so it was sort of easy to break up into like, you captain these 2 and I'll captain these 2, and then we'll come back together. And that stuff is all really fun. I mean, my least favorite personally part about writing is editing. So like the editing process, because I'm like, there's so many words, I have to read all of this again.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I get real snotty because I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, like I wrote it, so it's fine. Like I just
Sure.
like listen, if I thought it could have been better, I would have made it better when I wrote it.
That as perfectly sound logic to me. I agree entirely with that sentiment. How did you guys meet? Because I know that Janina, you're New Zealand and London and far away, but I'm assuming that hasn't been the case this whole dang time. And it's just, you have the pod and now the novel. How did it all begin?
I had written a book a few years ago called Things Gone Astray, which was my first sort of full-length, traditionally published. Jeffrey's getting his copy out.
Yeah.
It's got a beautiful. Look at that fucking cover. That is
lovely.
My friend Tegan, who is a genius artist. She's based in Melbourne, and she's an angel. So I had written that book, and it was just out in the world around. And I also knew Welcome to Night Vale because my partner used to play it out loud while he got ready for bed. So I would be sitting in bed reading a book, and there would be this incredibly soothing voice of Cecil, and then every so often I would catch some of the words and I'll be like, what are you listening to?
Sure.
And then I started listening myself, and obviously Night Vale is amazing. I got really into it. And then Jeffrey put a picture on his Tumblr, and my sister sent it to me because a fan had sent him like a crocheted bookmark of like a Welcome to Night Vale bookmark, and he put it on his Tumblr to say thank you. And it was sitting,
oh my god, look at it, beautiful. And
it was sitting in a copy of my book. So my sister sent it to me. She was like, did you see this? And I was like, oh my god. And then I tweeted saying, this is amazing. And we followed each other and became Twitter friends. And then the next time Night Vale was in London, which was a few months later, we hung out and became friends. And then it kind of started. Yeah, that's how it all started.
I love that.
Yeah, it was really fun. I forget, one of the nice things about like having a thing where you have some followers and have some recognition that you actually are a writer and you do a thing, is just that one of the nice things, if somebody else knows your work, it becomes a lot easier to meet them. To be like,
yeah,
because we both knew each other's work and we're like, all right, sure, we can hang out. That's way different than just being a rando, being like, hey, I read your book.
Yeah.
Hello,
I've read your book.
This has also been our philosophy for like this book tour. It's like collecting moderators who we can then be friends with. Like,
yeah,
what do we like? And then we want to know.
Just let me know when you're in New York City. Yeah. I will hang out for sure, and I'll make Johnny come up from DC, because it's very interesting. Like the relationship you guys have is similar to what Johnny and I have, that we are also in other cities and we collaborate creatively, and that's, I think there's something so like at the end of the day, I can always get online and see his face. Like there's something like my support is out there. Well, that's really lovely that you guys were like, let's use the internet for good.
Mm-hmm.
A rare
as opposed for evil, like everyone else is doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Listen. Okay. I have so many questions. And so I as you can tell, am a goofy comedian, and I started with improv in New York. And so much of your book to me having it be an alternate 20th century, which I think is such a cool concept of being like, here's what we know, and now let's twist it. And I think a lot of that is something that in improv we call, if this is true, what else is true? And that's how you like build your worlds and stuff like that. Was there anything in particular that you guys, either individually or together, were like, I'm looking forward to changing the past in this way? Or like, what do we keep? For example, my favorite thing was when in the footnotes, it was like, Shelley Winters wore a dress to the Golden Globes. And I'm like, the Golden Globes still exist in this world. So.
But maybe the Oscars don't.
Yeah.
I didn't mention
That's the thing. There's now the world, there's so much.
I actually think that improv framing is a really good way of thinking about it. Because it did start with like the world of the novel is a world we have been building out for our entire like working relationship. It's the same world as our podcast Within the Wires, that we tell standalone stories that are set in this one alternate timeline. And so the beginning of it was like, we're going to tell a story about these two women, and it's via relaxation cassettes, and there's we got to the story about a weird medical prison. And so it started from, okay, so if this is the story about these people, then what is the world like that this can exist? And then what has happened to the world to make it like this? And then every time we tell a new story set there's like other stuff we're building out, but it starts to also feed back in the other direction. Like if the world is like this, then what does that mean for this person? And it becomes a sort of conversation between the little small character stories that we're telling and the wider world that we're piecing together.
Right.
Yeah, it was. I think for me, like we started working on. Janina built this really great like timeline, like for ourselves to kind of like make sure we were in good continuity, right? That we didn't, that we had a checkpoint to come back to in writing the book and making sure the footnotes were right, et cetera, et cetera. But like outside of like the dates, it starts growing into this thing where you say, well, this obviously is a way different 20th century than we actually had. But because we're not writing a history book, we're not filling out the world with historical characters that are real. Like all the political characters are completely made up, and they're not necessarily modeled off of any, like, this is the John Kennedy of this timeline. This is whoever. But
well, I feel like the political landscape is completely different. It's not dominated by white men. So
yeah, very much so.
Yeah, and that was really important to us from the get-go of the podcast too. But I think what was really fun is like you said, Eileen, like having like Shelley Winters wore this dress designed by this fictional character is really fun, because the people that are still real in the real world that are in this fictional timeline tend to be artists. They tend to be painters or musicians or actors or some type of cultural figure in that sort of way, rather than a political figure. And for me, it was a way of just kind of keeping the touchstone of like, there's a thin veneer between this fictional timeline and our actual timeline, because in so many ways, like, this new society obviously is there's some probably very covert, awful things happening, but there's also a lot of really amazing things that are happening.
Yeah.
Whereas in our current timeline, like, there are not a lot of amazing things happening politically.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's still covert, terrible things happening.
Absolutely. I think it's a little bit of both, if not a majority of both. And interesting you say that with the timeline aspect. I was very curious, like right at the beginning, we get that the world has a big pandemic at the top of this book. And I was wondering, I was like, oh, did this begin? I wonder if they started writing this when the shit started hitting the fan, if you pardon my French, or if you guys have predicted something when you wrote this book.
We wrote those early chapters, I think in 2017, 2018, when we were first putting together the proposal.
Okay, so you guys are psychics, so that's good to know.
Well, it's more that we are historians, I think, like, because it's an alternate 20th century, but the beginning of the 20th century is similar to the beginning of the real 20th century.
Yeah.
In that there's all of this sort of nationalist existential crises going on in all these countries, which was sort of the driving force behind World War One. And then obviously we had here in the real world, we had the Spanish flu. So it was more like building out the idea that there's never just one cataclysm at a time. There's always multiple things happening, as there are now. Like, we have this pandemic, and we also have migration crises, and we also have had, Haiti had another devastating earthquake. Like, stuff doesn't stop because one big thing is happening.
Absolutely.
And so that's what we were basing things on. And then a pandemic hit, and that was awkward. I think the only thing that changed in those early chapters because of the pandemic is I got very aware of how we scientifically code viruses. And so I went and looked at like what the Spanish flu virus was, which is the H1N1 virus. Mm-hmm. And I came up with like something like that isn't real. Like, there's no virus that it has the coding that the one in the book has.
Sure.
But that's the only change, is that I suddenly was aware of that sort of stuff in a very real way that I would rather not know, to be quite honest with you.
I'm still very upset that the pandemic is like, you know what? It's an election year. Time to make my entrance.
Oh my goodness.
Right?
How dare she walk up in here like she owns the place. It's funny because I was telling my dad about doing this, and I was like trying to explain the book for him, and he goes, "The Spanish flu," and I was like, "Yeah, but it's not, Dad. It's an alternate thing." And he's like, "Okay, well," and I'm like, "Okay, relax, sir." So Miriam, she is a piece of work, this lady. I think something that I had so much fun with the book was the relationship between Miriam and the footnotes. And there was, I mean, I don't know if you meant it to be this way, but there was so much humor in there, in like her being like, "This is how it was," and then the footnotes being like, "Yeah, but it kind of wasn't." And I was wondering, like, did you mean to have this footnotes be so sassy? There was some sass to this footnotes.
What we wanted in particular is for that to develop over the course of it. We wanted it to start off feeling authoritative and unassailable and academic, and then for there to be a growing awareness that these were all written by a human person. Because I think we forget that often when we look at history. We look at it as an academic reality, and everything is facts and everything is emotionless, but all of that was written by people, and they all had their own biases, and they were writing in a specific context and with a specific agenda, because that's always true of everything. So
totally.
I wanted to just let it be a reminder that this isn't free from any sort of bias.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just finished listening to the audiobook that Harper did for this, and the two actors that are on the audiobook are really fantastic. They did a really nice job with the footnotes. That's a really hard thing to convey in an audiobook, but the interruptions serve really well. And the woman who does the footnotes in the audiobook, Adapero Oduye, she's so dry, and like in a really amazing way. And I had forgotten, there's a constant reference from Miriam talking about in the book, as Miriam is telling her story about not really paying attention to politics. She keeps referencing, like, I don't read the newspapers, like, this is not my thing. And then later Miriam, like dozens of pages later, Miriam is arguing with Rosemary and says something about the paper. And then the footnote comes in, and Adapero, the actor playing this, she goes, it seems that Miriam does read the newspaper.
Uh-huh.
Just that dry, and I was like, oh.
And that's how dry it read. I read
Yeah.
that line and I was like, this, ma'am, footnotes, ma'am, you have feelings about what Miriam is, how she's telling her story. It's such a good, like, it's weird to say that footnotes are dynamic, but these footnotes are very dynamic, and it's a lot of fun to just be like, and also puts you in this place of like, okay, well, because at least for me, and I don't consider myself particularly literary and erudite. I thank you so much. I used a big word for me, but I think you really, like, I'm used to trusting my narrator, and at least the books that I'm drawn to, and with Miriam, and I think big time because of the footnotes, you're like, I don't know if I can trust you, and at the same time, I don't know if I trust you, footnotes. Like, you're just in this world of who do I trust? Already I'm in a world that's going awry and having to deal with that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, but who's right? And it leaves the reader very unnerved, which I think lends a lot to the world that you're living in.
Yeah, that was the aim.
Great. You did it.
Yeah, I love how, like, it's funny, like, this is just like, not even to speak of like the current political and media climate where you're like, I don't know what truth is or whatever,
Right.
but just in life in general, right? Like the number of times where you realize that somebody, like, you get into an argument with somebody and you realize, like, deep down they're correct, but they're not right. If that makes any sense, because there's such an a-hole about it. Somebody gets really smug with you and you're like, it doesn't matter. I don't, fuck you. I don't take whatever you just said as truth. And you may walk away being like, they're right. They're just rude. So I'm not going to take that. And there's a lot of that. It was fun to play with that in the book too, because like Miriam isn't like, I think as a, like, I hope as a narrator, she's a really compelling persona, like
Absolutely.
really, really interesting, but she also doesn't seem like somebody that's that much fun to hang out with in IRL. If she were a real person, I don't know. It's hard to say. We didn't write that book, but but for me personally, she seems interesting. But there are moments in writing the book where you just kind of want Miriam's smugness to maybe rattle the reader a little bit, or the footnote writer's smugness. Like, they may be right, but a little bit is like, no, okay, you may be correct that she got this out of order, but you're not listening to what she's getting at here. Right.
And I think that also there are so many moments peppered throughout where Miriam does get to a point where she's like, my emotions are getting the better of me. She's so hell bent on giving you the facts about her life, and like almost like, this is my defense for what I did and how I led my life. And then when she gets to the places of like feelings, she's like, irrelevant. And that word is just all through that text. She's like, and I am nope, I'm not gonna let you into how I'm feeling. And I thought that was, it showed you who Miriam really was with that too.
Yeah, and I think part of that is like, she is a piece of work. She's also had a rough time, and maybe she's just, her experience of the world is that her emotions don't serve her well,
right?
And at the end of her life, that's a lesson that's tough to unlearn.
Yeah. I remember when we first had like turned in the first draft of this book to the editor, we did a couple of drafts on our end before turning it in, and but I remember one of the first notes that we had got back was like, in that first chapter of like, would she not remember her, the whether or not her family loved her or she loved her family? Would she say anyway irrelevant about that? And we're like, yeah. She totally would. And it just kind of, it's interesting, like, kind of like it gave us like a way to kind of dive in more to like see where those moments happen. And it was really interesting to like play around with how she drives down a certain path and then she definitely sees the dead end sign. It's like, nope, turn around.
Yeah.
It's interesting to do that, because I really like to play with characters' emotions. Like, I like it when somebody has an emotion, and then I can be real florid with language or be real poetic about it or something like that. And with Miriam, I'm like, oh, this kind of feels good to drive away from this trash fire for a little bit.
Yeah.
Nope. Turn around and leave. And it was an interesting new thing for me, and I thought that was really fun to play with.
Totally. And I think that kind of brings up the question of like, so the process that she develops that leads into making the world, or helping the world come back from big disaster, which is the watercolor quiet. I was really interested in like because not for nothing, in my mind, I was like, this kind of sounds Scientology. there was a vibe of like, if the kids were holding cans, that this could totally be like a Scientology situation. But like, what inspired the watercolor quiet? I think, meditation obviously is involved in that, I think. But like, I was reading it and I was like, I wonder how. So please explain the watercolor quiet.
I mean, I think that that's interesting to compare it to Scientology, because essentially how it is used, not necessarily Miriam's goal in developing, although maybe, but like it's used for control, right? Like it's used to be selective about what people know and what they don't know. And that then drives the rest of their lives, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, but this is something that it's been built into this universe of the new society from the beginning, is the idea that you lose your memories when you hit 10. You have any personal connections erased, and you are raised alone rather than in connection with your family or anything like that. So in developing the process that could lead to that, we kind of had to go back and look at how did that become a thing, and why would that have become a thing, and so to start just with simple one person trying to deal with trauma and the fact that she's living in this horrific world, and that impacts your ability to function just in day-to-day life, and then build out that further and further out into the nth degree until it can be used as this like world-changing process. Is kind of where it comes from.
There was when we started the first season of Within the Wires, which is all the relaxation cassettes kind of that tell a story of trying to get you, the listener who's listening to those relaxation cassettes, to escape from whatever medical prison you're in. I had heard the term. I had started when we were making that season 6 years ago. I had started listening to a bunch of relaxation cassettes and started going down the path of like different types of relaxation and visualization, breathing exercises. And I had found Autogenic Training, which is this like psychophysiological thing, which is this belief that like something about your physicality connecting to your mental state as well. Like, and obviously your body is connected to your mind, et cetera, et cetera. But
sure.
It led me down this like really weird path to this rabbit hole of like in the early 20th century, like we were really obsessed with like understanding psychology, and everyone was trying to find a way in. And I looked up this dude, like when I looked up Autogenic Training on Wikipedia, the first thing I found was it was invented by a German in 1932. And I was like, oh
boy.
No. And I was like, and that exactly goes where you think it's going to go. Yeah, it was it was really fascinating to me, just like how long we've been obsessed with psychology. And I'm sure individual psychologists are like, I just want to understand the science of how the human mind works. But governments and military and corporations for years have been like, how do we use this to control somebody?
Right.
And so that was really interesting to me as well.
Absolutely. I asked Johnny, my best friend, to send me also like questions that he had before he had to peace out, and he was like, I have one. And so our podcast is a horror podcast, and Jeffrey, when you emailed us, you had said that the book isn't necessarily horror, but there are definitely horror elements in it, which I agree. And Johnny asked, what are your relationships to the horror genre in film and literature, and what scares you?
The scary, I think, I don't scare easily. Because I have a mother who liked to watch like a lot of medical documentary shows when I was a kid. So
okay, so your horror is like a real horror.
No, just like I've seen it all, you know. Once you've watched a million TV shows about someone being cut open to fix a thing, it's very difficult to be phased. So I'm always more interested in how it affects. Well, I think it's like anything that puts characters under a pressure cooker, I think is interesting. And then stuff that really gets under your skin, I think is always the stuff that seems like it's no big deal. Like a friend of mine had a book out a couple of years ago called Melmoth, which is a retelling of Charles Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer. And it's a Gothic novel, and it operates like a lot of Gothic novels in that it's like someone collecting together a lot of evidence and documents. So half of the book is like, here is a torn page from a thing that tells this one story about someone who came across Melmoth, who is this like ghost essentially, who wanders the world as a witness and witnesses people's worst atrocities.
Ooh.
And this book, I mean, Sarah is a genius, my friend who wrote it, and it's no surprise that it had this effect, but you got to the end of it because it was about, here is this one woman who has discovered all these stories, and Melmoth is now following her, and so she keeps seeing Melmoth around, and then you close the book and you're like, I don't want to look over my shoulder because I'm pretty sure it makes you feel like you were just the latest person to collect together all these stories, and now there is Melmoth behind you. And that's the sort of stuff that I love, that just makes you think like, I can't quite trust the world anymore. Just even for a moment, which I find really, really interesting.
Love that.
I've always been, I mean, like, as you know, I'm getting better because I've seen like 80 movies in the last year and a half, but like I'm very squeamish about like graphic horror, like grossness or gore, things like that. So I still am a little bit that way. But I've always loved reading horror. Like I don't scare easily when it comes to that. I get creeped out very easily, which I really love that feeling. And I think for me, I think the stuff that sits with me, that like unnerves me, like not close your eyes, jump scare type of stuff. I mean, that startles me more than anything, but like that really goes into like chills my bones is people behaving in ways that don't seem logical. There's a scene in Mulholland Drive, which is David Lynch has always chilled me to my bones. Like
creepy
in weird ways. But there's this really benign scene where, the film, Justin Theroux, the film director, comes home and he sees the pool, he sees the pool truck out front, and he goes in and he doesn't see his wife, and he walks in he knows his wife is having an affair with the pool cleaner. And when he opens the door to the bedroom, the two of them are in bed, but they're sitting up under the covers, just staring right at him. And it's like, it's such a jarring scene because it's just not the thing you're expecting. And it completely cuts his knees out from under him. He has no power. He didn't catch them in the act. They were ready for him. And like, so when people play, when people do that, it's that stuff is really chilling to know when you think you're in control and then you realize, oh, I'm not.
Oh yeah.
That's really scary to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Something that looks like human, but is just slightly wrong is much scarier than like a big alien monster a lot of the time, I think.
Absolutely. Who can you trust?
Yeah.
There you go. Who can you trust? Well, I'm gonna trust some audience members now because we're gonna ask some questions from the audience. The first one we have is from Hamill, and he says, what made you decide to go into the books with the what your podcast world, WTW world within the YAs?
What inspired us to go into it to do a book?
What
in it?
made you to go
Yeah.
into the books with the world? Yeah, with the universe.
I think.
Oh, go for
Oh
it.
no,
Sorry.
you go.
Yeah, it was, I mean, for me, in choosing to make any type of story, it has to do with the medium first. And so like when we made the podcast, like it was always found audio. And we just enjoy writing together. And one thing you don't get to do in the podcast is kind of have the freedom of language and exploration and of a novel. Like a novel can just be so many other places. And we did choose a first person narrator and the footnote author too. So it limits your point of view, but you can span so much more time. And in the podcast with the structure that we have there, it's just a different sort of environment. And I don't know, Janina's fun to write with. We had this relationship with Harper, and it's like, we should ask if they want to do a book. And they did. And so we were like, absolutely, this sounds fun. And it gave us a chance to kind of like tell the story of an entire life. And obliquely an entire century of this alternate world timeline, this alternate history. So yeah, it was just exciting. Sometimes you just are like, we could do this. What if we did this? Let's try and do it. And we both have written books, so why not? Why not is the short answer to almost
why not,
why I did it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question from Louis. How was collaborating on a book different or the same as collaborating on a podcast?
A lot of it is similar in that, like when we write the podcast, we outline it and then we take turns. Like one of us will write all of the odd numbers and one of us will write all the even numbers, and then we swap and rewrite and edit and do all that. I think with a book, there are just a lot more stages to the process where things can get tight. You know, like once you get into the editing process, it's like it gets a lot more challenging because we both have to go through it all with the notes that we've been sent through. Like I stayed up till 4 a.m. doing a copy edit because I was like, I have to get through this because Jeffrey has to have a chance to read it too.
Right.
But yeah, I think for the most part it's similar. It's just the sort of crunch time that it is different, because when we do the podcast, it's just we do it and we both say we're happy and then we record it, and maybe we change some little things as we record if they sound better, you know, at the time. But it doesn't have that same sort of going over sentences with a fine-tooth comb that writing a book does.
It's so like, this sounds so flippant, but like the big difference is it's so many more words.
A lot more words.
But it really is like, because like with a 10 episode season of the podcast is going to be about 25,000 words, and this book is about 95,000 words. I think it was 95,000, somewhere around in there. I forget the final total, but it's I mean that's a huge difference. That's like almost 4 seasons of the podcast.
Wow.
And so to keep track of everything, like, because it's not just keeping track of details of information, but it's things like just knowing that, like, oh, we used the word strange in this previous paragraph.
Sure.
And we keep saying strange. We should probably find a different word. Weird. Let's say weird, you know, something like that. But it's also like, what is the pacing of all of this? You know, people aren't digesting it in 20-minute listening sessions once a week. They may sit down and read it for a couple hours straight. So like, what's the pacing like? So you kind of, and the editing process for a novel for me is such a pain, because I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to read this again, aren't I? I have to like actually sit down and like read the whole thing and get a feel for it, which is a lot harder to do than just like, oh, let me listen to this 20-minute episode and make sure it sounds good.
Right. Totally.
Especially because I don't know if you're the same, Jeffrey, but I have a very intense don't touch it, don't look at it relationship to my work. So once I've written something, I'm like, I never want to see this again.
Yep.
Sure.
And you have to look at it so many times.
Yeah.
Oh, guys, you did it though. It's out of your hands now. Now you don't got to think about it anymore. Okay, so we have a question from Kelly. Where do you see Within the Wires going? Can you tease the future a bit?
We have not talked about the next season at all yet.
Oh, okay.
So No, we can't.
No.
We can't because we don't know what it's going to be.
We
Um,
absolutely don't know.
Yeah, but
We're gonna
they
keep
will-
doing it because it's fun.
Yeah,
You know,
Good.
and hopefully
Yeah.
make another book. If they'll make another book for us, we would happily make another book.
yeah,
But we haven't even talked about what that would be yet either. So
yeah. So there's something. There is a future. That's
Yeah.
the most we can tell you.
Well, I mean, it's all we ever ask from you. And now, especially since we've deep dived into Miriam's world and see like all the detail there, I'm sure it's, I mean, when I got to the very end and was like, it's in the same universe, I was like, it's in the same universe. Oh my God. So now I'm going to get all up and within the wires and fucking binge it and be like, okay, give me the juice, because I love the aspect of listening, and now we have the book, and so what could be next? Verbal, I don't know, what are other things that
Yeah.
how people communicate?
A movie.
A movie,
Visual.
that's it. Eyeballs.
that's
A
awesome.
movie.
Eyeballs is next. I want to thank you three so much for a ridiculously fun conversation. It's like 1 p.m. my time almost. This was like the best lunchtime experience of my life. Thank you for joining Tattered Cover, and everyone out there watching virtually, or if you're going to watch it later, you can get their book at tatteredcover.com. I said it at the beginning of the hour, but where can we find you? Where should we follow you on social media? Where can we connect?
Well, I am Janina Diff on all of the places. I have a very fraught relationship with social media, but I am there way too much. So,
And I'm Happier Man on Twitter, and we're also Within the Wires on Twitter as well. If you just want to catch up on what's happening in the podcast and all that sort of stuff.
I'm at Eileen Little Hands, Lil, and hands with a Z, on Twitter and on Instagram. And you can follow my podcast, Uy Que Horror, on Instagram and Twitter as well.
It's such
yeah,
a good podcast,
it's really good. You
y'all.
should listen to it.
Yeah.
I can't wait.
Guys,
I
so
have
good.
just been getting into horror. I just wasn't really into it. I mean, Scream's my favorite horror movie of all time.
Great
I don't know.
choice.
you know?
Rips.
Great choice.
All 4 Screams hold up really well as well.
Yeah,
Delightful franchise.
Yeah, and I really got into horror comics lately. That's what I've been reading. So I can't
Also,
wait to
lots
check
of
out,
fun.
Eileen, the podcast. Yes, I'm excited.
Oh, you should,
Um,
Adam. It's so good. I'm the same as you. I'm very
I
horror
subscribed
squeamish.
right
Yeah.
now.
Awesome.
And
Thanks, guys.
yes, all the podcasts, everything's so amazing. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a great day / evening / travel / whatever you're up to next.
Thanks,
Have a great
Adam.
weekend.
All right.
Thanks, Adam.
Bye,
Thanks,
y'all.
guys. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Bye,
Thank
Eileen.
you. Bye.
Cool. And we're no longer live. So if